very warm welcome to those who are joining us this morning. The Irish Sport on Social Media report is produced every month by my good friends Stephen O'Leary and latterly Ross Broomfield at Olytico. It is always one of the most popular pieces of content that we produce on the site because it gives real insight and a degree of insight that is not openly available outside of our small niche world. And because social media is so important in terms of our sporting organizations, in terms of how brands look to get value from what they're doing with you, it's something that is very measurable and has a real impact. So we've been looking at this over the last couple of months and thinking that wouldn't it be interesting to actually have a few of our members into the room to actually discuss and have a chat about the numbers. So I'm delighted this morning. We've got a good cross section from across the sporting spectrum, and a very warm welcome to all of you out there. But without further ado, let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. We, as I say, produce it each month. We look at 30 sporting organisations, soon to be 31 now, with the welcome addition of Sailing Ireland, who are our newest member to come on board. And we look at it across the three principal commercial channels, at least anyway, of Twitter, Facebook, and especially Instagram. More of that anon. The report looks at the detailed analysis that Olytico can produce for brands and across a whole number of different sectors. You'll be very familiar with Stephen O'Leary from appearing on multiple radio and television news bulletins, talking about things from sport to politics to business and everything else. And you're very welcome to join us this morning, Stephen.
Thanks, Rob.
And Ross, who has taken over the authorship of the report over recent months as well. You're very welcome, Ross.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us on.
Absolute pleasure. The report that we put out this week, looking back on October, probably one of the most interesting, and it's always something that causes fascination for me. But the fact that we were going up was understandable. The fact that the number of engagements was going up was understandable. The fact that the number of engagements on Instagram went up from 2.2 to 3.2 million in the course of the month was, to my eyes, somewhat staggering. What was that in context, do you think, Ross? Is that something that was building and waiting, because we've been talking for the last 2 years about how Instagram was the giant in the room?
I think so. I think from my point of view, it's been interesting having sort of taken over the analysis and insights of this from February. So starting the month before lockdown actually happened, and actually seeing the initial decrease in engagements over the initial lockdown months, and just seeing the steady rise of the use of the platforms as we sort of came out of lockdown initially, with the sporting organisations keeping their members up to date with all of the latest COVID rules and regulations. And it's something that's been increasing over the last 3 months. And it's really been since July that we've seen the number of engagements sort of taking off back to a level that we sort of saw pre-COVID as well. But I think the COVID period social media was a principal way for some of the Sports for Business members to engage with their fans, and it became even more important during that period. And what was interesting for us as analysts was seeing the changes in habits of users. So more people have been on Twitter, more people have been on Instagram for longer, whether that's just as a result of working from home or looking for things to fill the time. But it's definitely a trend that we see continuing over the next few months.
I know that my screen time last week in particular, following the US elections, hit a spike which I can never allow my children to see, because that would undermine everything I say to them about not being constantly on your phone. But you're right. It has proven to be a very important channel through the course of lockdown, but it was already there, wasn't it? I mean, it's become that sort of almost disintermediated way of sporting organizations, whether it be from the IRFU through to, Hockey Ireland, through to volleyball, through to, all of the national governing bodies out there, that they're able to actually speak directly to their own audience and their own niche audience. Is there a danger that we might overstate that, though? That, that the prospect of speaking to your own becomes so important that you begin to lessen the importance of speaking to the wider subsection, because the media is such a fractured environment at the moment now, and we all live in our own echo chambers. Is social media as important as it looks to be?
I don't think you can understate the importance of social media to sporting organizations at the moment. And I think, if we look back at the last year, there have been some fundamental changes in the way sporting organizations and individual athletes have started to approach social media. And part of that is because of the way reactions to those organizations and individuals have also changed. So if you imagine, I think most of the world probably took, like a lot of things, sport for granted up until March of this year. Sport has always been there through weather, through almost any other circumstance. We've had sport, and we've had it in ever increasing numbers. And suddenly, in March, it stopped being there. We couldn't participate, and we also couldn't consume it in the ways that we used to. So a lot of people turned to social media in increasing numbers. And we know beyond sport, for example, that, Twitter content in Ireland, the amount of actual content published on the network increased 30% quarter on quarter. And that's despite the fact that in Q1 of this year, you'll remember we had a general election, which is one of the most talked about things, on Twitter in the country ever. So there is this huge increase in the number of people who are communicating on the platform, and sporting organizations, rightly recognize this. So they realize that this conversation is taking place. They know this is a place people are going in ever increasing numbers to get news as well as entertainment. And I think they're responding by increasing the amount of content they're putting out on the platform. So I don't think it's an either or. I don't think this is like saying, well, if we focus too much on social media, then we'll forget about or neglect traditional media, for want of a better word. In fact, I think the two complement each other really well. And you see this cycle. So you see TV news, radio, newspapers reporting on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And equally, sports organizations, amongst others, using Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to promote traditional media coverage they've gotten in newspapers, on television, and on the radio. So I think there can be a virtuous circle. And I think the other key change we've seen is that there is a level of positivity there now that didn't exist before. Because I think when fans and when individuals began to realize that there wasn't the same type of access in terms of TV coverage and traditional media and actual games being played, they suddenly realized that these athletes and these sporting organizations needed to be looked after, and that they needed to be almost nicer to them, because there was no onus on these organizations or individuals to continue producing content when nothing was happening. And yet they stepped up to the plate. They went into the archives and they did lots of different ways to ensure that fans still had something to look at, something to cheer about. And we saw a marked change in sentiment towards both organizations and individual athletes. And I think, there's a multitude of high profile examples of this, but, the recent work of Marcus Rashford is one that really stands out. Someone who probably a year ago associated social networks with a place where his performance was, essentially torn apart whenever he didn't score or didn't play well, has transformed into a place where really now, when we look at it objectively, and it's not that there's not still abuse happening on the platforms, but objectively looking at the actual data, there is this groundswell of support across all clubs and wider society for the work that he's doing, and he's leveraging social networks. So I think it's not just sporting organizations, but we're seeing athletes in 2020 use social media in a different way, and it's been great to see.
Yeah, a little exclusive. We'll be launching our Sport for Social Good event and report next week. which will be taking place in December, and we've got Man United coming online to talk about the way that they have been working within their community and touching on Marcus Rashford's high profile and just more than high profile, really high impact engagement with the world. Looking at some of the numbers, comparing the three channels across each other as well. Looking at the number of posts that the GAA put up over the course of October, they had 521 on Facebook. It went up to 856 on Twitter and was as low as 23 on Instagram. Is there an optimum balance that you found between how organizations should actually balance their time out between the three?
Ross and I might have kind of different views on this, but Ross, do you want to maybe take this first, and then I can kind of chime in?
Yeah, no, I think all of the organizations that we monitor as part of this report tend to have slightly different strategies, slightly different priorities, as it were. So, yeah, the GAA are always very active on Facebook, less so perhaps on Instagram, but it's possibly where the audience is live for the individual organizations as well. And it does vary from month to month. The GAA were sort of very active with their archive footage during lockdown without any live games to sort of report on. The sort of GAA Now Rewind content proved to be very popular for them during the lockdown months. And we see the ebbs and flows with some of the national bodies. If they have games or not, they'll focus on different platforms. So it sort of very much varies in terms of what is going on the pitch or on the track or whatever it might be. But I wouldn't say there's one hard and fast rule to follow. It's almost trying to see if different content and strategies work on different platforms. The one thing that we sort of always say is, if there's a piece of content that is going to go well, put it across all three channels, but tweak it slightly so that a fan isn't just sort of served the same piece of content on Twitter, and then when they go on Instagram and Facebook, they see exactly the same things. There are different angles that organizations can take, whether it's a different viewpoint of footage or whatever it might be, or even a different image celebrating the same sort of iconic moment or whatever it might be, but just tweak it slightly to get the most engagement from it.
Yeah, I think maybe just to build on Ross's point there, that idea of serving slightly different content on different networks, I think an organization who do this really well are the IRFU. And I think a couple of years ago, if you had said to someone, well, yeah, Instagram's great, but you have to have really visual content. I mean, it only works if you've got a great photograph or a great video. You couldn't do, for example, score updates like you do on Twitter, and that work really well, maybe on that kind of real-time news social network. And yet the IRFU have shown that that's absolutely not the case. And I think if we look at sporting organizations in Ireland, and if anyone is on the call today and thinking about ways they could potentially learn from other organizations and maybe find ways to build on it, they do an extremely good job of providing score updates on Instagram. And the way they do it is they've got assets that are essentially ready to go. So they have a really nice template where when someone scores a try, or someone scores a conversion, or at halftime and full time. So you might have 8, 10, 12 points during a game when the opportunity to publish a piece of content comes through. And these pieces of content generate thousands of engagements. And you can look to other sports and sporting bodies and codes and see where that would potentially work really well. So, a lot of fans would have seen that last moment or that last minute goal for Cork at the weekend. Now, that's the type of update that if it had gone out on Instagram would have proved exceptionally popular. And I'm sure there were different bodies who did share that at the time, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the video. It doesn't have to be the footage. So if you don't have the footage itself, maybe you're not the rights holder to the video footage, but the moment has happened. Well, if you've got something ready to go, someone's going to score at some point. There's going to be certain moments like halftime, full time. you can plan and prepare these things in advance and have them ready to go. And then if you share them on the network and people are there, the engagement will come and fans will look at it. And I think one thing we've learned is that as a network, there is no sporting body at the moment that we see in Ireland who is serving too little content to their fans on Instagram. Sorry, the inverse, too much content to their fans on Instagram. So there is, every single body has the opportunity, provided the content exists and they have stuff to share, to increase the amount of footage, our updates, our results, our photography on Instagram as a platform.
There's 7 of the organizations that are getting an average engagement on the Instagram post of over 1,000 every single time they put one out there. So the numbers tell that it is an incredibly important one. The number of engagements on Instagram is out of all proportion to the other two. So, again, you're looking at the FAI, 5,516 average engagement on Instagram, 738 on Facebook, and on Twitter, they've got 398. So it's a factor of 10, effectively, that Instagram is doing it. Is there a psychological reason behind that? Because the content and the timing of it isn't so markedly different, that they're not serving an entirely different audience in an entirely different way. But the engagement on Instagram, is it easier to double tap? Is there correspondingly a greater value in the scarcity of engagements on the other social networks?
I don't think it's that there is, I don't think you can call a like or a comment or a share on one of the networks more valuable than another. So I don't think Twitter or Facebook or Instagram carries any greater weight necessarily when someone engages. But I think you can look to maybe some of the reasons why engagement levels on Instagram are higher. I mean, if you look at the user behavior and you imagine 2 situations, so you're scrolling through Twitter and the sporting body you follow has a piece of information. So it could be a score update, it could be a piece of news, it could be a team announcement, and you consume it as news. It's almost a news style engagement. So you see it, you stop it, you view it. And this is where sometimes the insights from the networks themselves are really important. So we can only see the public engagements, but each sporting organization will have their own insights from Twitter behind that, where they can see, for example, how many people clicked on the tweet, maybe how many people viewed the video, and other things. And they're important to be aware of. But on Instagram, it's got much more of an entertainment feel to it. So it elicits a different kind of emotional response when you are consuming it. And so therefore we see people who are liking and commenting. There's also possibly a different demographic. So if you've got 500,000 fans or followers, those who follow you on Instagram may be very different to the fans who follow you on Facebook and who follow you on Twitter. So to Ross's point earlier, it's vitally important that if you've got good content, that you do maximize each of the social networks you have access to. Absolutely tweak it and tailor it slightly, but don't feel that something can only be used on one of the networks, because for the most part, content is applicable across all networks, and it's highly likely that your audience on those networks are going to be quite different.
Okay. Can I check in about the sophistication of how we use social media? Whenever I discuss this in terms of the US or a UK context and some of the big professional sports organizations like the big Premier League clubs, there's always a very detailed template as to how they're going to use it, between storytelling to make fans like you, news updates to keep fans informed, and commercial updates to either sell something or to promote a sponsor. And they'll break it down according to the day and according to the timeline towards the next big occasion. Do we do enough of that here, do you think? Or is the audience just not quite big enough to justify the kind of investment that would go into that level of intense detail?
I think from what I've seen with the analysis, I think sort of the last few months have given some of the content and strategy teams a perfect opportunity almost to explore some different content opportunities, because for the most part it has been the in-house social media teams that have had the access to the behind the scenes footage of teams training or access to the players that they may not necessarily have had in the past. They might only have had them for specific windows, but looking to sort of work on their strategy and content plans over lockdown, I think has sort of opened up quite a few opportunities and areas for organizations. And I think they've actually adapted very well over the last few months. And we've seen some of the sports for business members do work with partners and sort of providing some value that way. But I don't think in any way, shape or form, the Irish market or demographic is too small to be doing these things. I think it just means that you'll be working to perhaps a slightly more niche, but also a more engaged audience as well, because people follow who they want to follow. So you have to cater to that audience, and whether it's with a commercial partner or whatever it might be. I think we've seen a number of the Irish sporting bodies doing this particularly well over the last few months. And what we've seen is the engagements have been driven by almost series of content. So there have been monthly challenges that organizations have done. There's been a regular campaign. Hockey Ireland introduced a lot of their new squad members, which proved to be massively popular because it had that sort of human touch to it. So the fans were getting to know the next internationals and everything. So to sort of go back to the crux of the question, I don't think Ireland is behind in that way. I think it's just playing to a sort of slightly smaller but equally engaged audience, really. So I think there's a lot to be positive about the moment and the way in which the sporting bodies have adapted and are developing their content strategies.
I think there's two commercial opportunities here too that are important to kind of point out. So again, I don't know what the breakdown of the audience we have on the call today looks like, but if you imagine maybe we've got a mix of both sporting bodies and maybe rights holders, our sponsors, you know, the bodies themselves, the sports bodies themselves, you know, obviously there is a time commitment, right? So you have to put time into creating a calendar like the one you described, Rob, where you break down those kind of maybe key pillars and you then think about the content that's going to go into that. And, you know, I think we should be under no illusion that the bigger the sporting the organization, maybe the more resources they have to dedicate to something like this. So, you know, I don't think it's fair sometimes for some of the smaller sporting bodies to think that they can produce the type of content that an IRFU or a GA or an FAI will do. And I think that's also important when you're looking at the ranking here or this table. I think inevitably those with the largest following and the biggest commercial organizations are going to sit at the top. But having said all that, I think every sporting body, no matter their size, will have commercial partners. They will have sponsors, they will have backers, they will have people who will fund the organization. And those commercial partners will receive reports from the body, right? And so those reports will span a wide range of things like the performance of the team or the individual athletes, the structure of the organization. But one of the things they will also look about is the media coverage or the social media coverage that that organization generates. And, you know, while you want fans themselves to be out talking about you and saying nice things, you also have a degree of control. So if you invest time in that calendar at the start of the year or at different points in the year, and you know where you're going to put out content, one of the benefits is at the end of the year, you can point to that as work that has been done and critically work that quite often maybe mentions or features these commercial partners. So you can show a return on investment that sponsors or other people are putting in. On the flip side, the sponsors themselves, I think, and we definitely see this in Ireland, there are very few sponsors in Ireland who are maximizing the value of the sponsorships they have from a social media point of view. Now, there are many who do a really good job here, and we work with some of them, and I won't sort of name anyone in particular, but there's a wide range of sponsors who do a good job. But are any of them capping out the potential here? Absolutely not. And if I speak from personal experience, when I worked as a sports agent in the past and we represented professional golfers, you know, these golfers would carry the logos of the organizations who sponsor them. So few of those organizations then, for example, tweet or post about the performance of those individual athletes. And yet it is such an opportunity for them. So you think about, for example, the start of the Masters this week, we've got great Irish representation, both at a professional and an amateur level. I wonder how many of the sponsors of those Irish players, or any of the players in the field, for example, will be maximizing the value of that asset this week. And that's what they have. They have an asset. So I think that's just an example, I think, on the flip side, where those who aren't necessarily the sporting organizations themselves, but those who are associated with them, can start to leverage the value that these sporting bodies and athletes are creating.
You're absolutely right. We wrote a piece this morning on the the discreet nature of Masters sponsorship, and there's only 3 global sponsors, and you really do have to look long and hard on their website or around Augusta to see who they are. They're AT&T, IBM, and Mercedes, but the golfers themselves will be out there, and Bank of Ireland and Armidis, they're both on Shane Lowry's shirt. He's playing alongside Tiger Woods for the first 2 rounds of it, so there's going to be a natural emphasis on that. But watch out for Bryson DeChambeau as well. He's got a new sponsor that will be appearing on his cap. I won't say who it is, but it's not Sport for Business, I can assure you of that. Probably not Olytico either.
Not this year. Yeah.
But it is interesting, and it'll be interesting to see just how that brand does, as you say, to actually sort of highlight that. I want to spend just a couple of minutes more just chatting generally with you, and I'd love to open it up so that if you've got any questions in the room that you want to put them forward. So I think the easiest thing will be that if you want to put it into the Q&A box, but the alternative, if you want to, I think in this we've got the opportunity to sort of put your hand up to say that you want to speak, and we can actually bring you into the room as well if you prefer to do that. But whatever means, but take this opportunity, because Ross and Steve are 2 experts in this field, so they will undoubtedly give you a helping hand. One of the areas, and it was asked earlier in the week, how can you do particular tactics to actually look at increasing the level of engagement? So it's easy to see how you can produce more content. Maybe not so easy to actually produce really good content, but it's easy to see, well, okay, so I can on the hour, every hour, I can post something which is out there. But are there any tactical tricks? Try saying that when you've had a too many cups of coffee, that you can actually look to increase the number of engagement, because clearly that is perhaps the most important metric in there. It's not how much you do, but it's how deep it lands with your audience.
So yeah, go for it, Ross.
No, I was just going to say, I think the very nature of social media is that it shouldn't just be a news service. It shouldn't just be an update service. The very nature of it is engage with your audience. So people are following you because they want to engage, and often we see it can be the simplest of mechanics. It can be a question about the day's play, or it can be who do you think is going to come out on top at a particular championship. It's inviting that engagement to come, but also it's not only that, but it's also following up on the back of it. There's no point in putting something out there if it's just going to fall into a dead area. You need to pick up on the sort of the best comments and engage back with your audience on that, because that's how the engagements grow, and the sort of authentic nature of the social media grows in that regard. And I think, to your point, Rob, in terms of putting something out on the hour, every hour, it sometimes becomes a little bit like wallpaper. People see exactly the same thing. So what we saw over lockdown in particular was almost the monthly campaigns, that people knew that there was going to be something at a particular time on a day posted from a sporting organisation. So I remember Cricket Ireland did a DIY cricket series on Instagram, which saw their engagements for that month sort of skyrocket as well, because it was providing their followers with something that obviously resonated and hopefully they will sort of be replicating that further down the line, because it's only by testing some of these campaigns that you can get a feel for what your audience wants. And for example, Triathlon Ireland did a stay indoors and keep pedaling campaign that I think they actually did, if memory serves me right, with BMW, who are one of their partners, and Zwift. So it was also a way in which they used the lockdown period and technology to sort of keep their audience engaged in an authentic way as well. And it was a way in which they could bring in their partners and provide a bit of value for that. And the work that's gone in during lockdown, I think, can definitely be built on as we actually come back to a semblance of normality. I think a lot of hard work and effort has gone in during these months, and I think it would be a real shame if the momentum was lost over the next few months as hopefully we come out of lockdown and get back to sort of normal, as it were.
I think to build on that, there's sometimes when we think about kind of like that tactical approach or the best way to come up with things to maybe sort of like talk about or share, and I'm sure there will be maybe sort of sporting bodies on the call today who are kind of saying, well, look, again, maybe we don't have the assets, maybe we don't have the level of activity, maybe we don't have things to talk about, and we don't want to kind of shoehorn kind of stuff in there. It needs to kind of just, we need to have things to actually talk about to put them up on social. But I think regardless of the size of your organization, one of the biggest missed opportunities that exists, and this does not apply just to sport, but we see it across the spectrum of organizations in all walks of life, is that social media continues to be seen as a broadcast platform. Now, I appreciate that we are here measuring the performance of what these organizations are broadcasting, and that is not lost on me. It is what the organizations are pushing out to their fans. But having said that, quite often, if you can take a step back and start listening to what your fans are saying about your athletes, about your teams, about your organization, and sometimes more broadly about your sport, there is this wealth of excellent content that exists, and really all you sometimes need to do is just amplify that. So the simple act of kind of retweeting content or replying to content, one thing that I think a lot of fans never expect, because it happens so rarely, is a sporting body or an athlete to acknowledge their existence, right? And if you transfer this to other walks of life, if a particular fan of a particular band, for example, has their tweet liked or acknowledged by the band or a member of the band, they'll pin that to their profile and wear it like a badge of honor. Tweet liked by person X on date Y. This is a thing that actually exists. So I'm not suggesting that sports fans in Ireland would necessarily go to those lengths, but it shows you, I suppose, that sporting bodies and athletes don't necessarily engage with their fan base as much as they possibly could be. There is always a resource consideration here. This is not a suggestion that you have to reply or acknowledge or engage with every single time you're mentioned. But again, if the question you have, or one of the things you're maybe struggling with is, well, I'm not sure what to push out there, I don't know if we've got great content. If that ever comes up, well, take a step back, start listening to what people are saying about you or your athletes or your sport, and there should be a wealth of content for you to either amplify or engage with, or otherwise start to kind of create content.
Yeah, and I think it's worth bearing in mind as well, there are a lot of intelligent people out there on social media. It gets a bad rap that it's full of trolls and all the rest of it. Generally speaking, if somebody criticizes you, it's always worth just clicking on the generally an egg to see that they've got 3 followers, and you realize that they're just shouting at the mirror, and if it's not you, it's going to be somebody else the following day. But I do remember back in the early days of Twitter, I remember the Guardian newspaper highlighting us as being an account that was worth following. And I only realized it, especially when you wake up the next morning and you've got 1,000 extra followers that are there because somebody else has actually said something good. So you never quite know where the genuine kind of impactful love is going to happen on social, but it is out there. And you're right, having a conversation and retweeting carefully at times what some people are saying can often be very worthwhile. Got a couple of questions that come in. Trassa Cox from Sailing Ireland Are there examples of niche sports, so outside of the big three, or in international terms, outside of the rugbies and the footballs, that are doing things really well that we can learn from? And I think if you look at around Olympic periods, there will be, from Rio and even from London, which was probably the first digital Olympics, there are some sponsor campaigns that really took off on social media and did well. So, knowing the timing of things is very important. But are there any in the course of lockdown or over the past year that you would have noticed that really stood out as being a good way for a sport that was not on the back pages, getting itself noticed?
I think one of the interesting things as well was with everything that was going on, we almost forgot that the Olympics was postponed, and we've got an Olympics to look forward to next year. So it sort of around Special Olympics Ireland, they did a Together at Home campaign, sort of trying to build on the interest that was happening around the Olympics at the time, and will obviously build, fingers crossed, if Tokyo goes ahead next year as well. I think Basketball Ireland are consistently pretty clever on what they do on social, whether it's, again, the 28-day challenge that they did, or they were very clever and lucky to some extent that they were able to capitalize on the interest in the Last Dance, the Netflix documentary about the Chicago Bulls. So the interest in basketball, they actually were able to jump on that and sort of build some engagement around that as well. I think Badminton Ireland have done a good job in their series of webinars as well, keeping their members informed of all of the updates and developments, whether they're allowed to go back to playing sport. So I think there are definite opportunities for some of the niche sports to still thrive in these times. And I'm very conscious when I'm doing the analysis on these reports that it's not all about the soccer and the rugby. Always try and highlight some of the excellent work that some of the smaller sporting organisations are doing, because the improvements and increases are all relative at the end of the day. So when we see Badminton Ireland or when we see Hockey Ireland rising up the rankings tables, it's always worth highlighting that, and we like to think that we do that to show that we are listening and seeing what they are doing, and sort of hopefully it provides some of the other organisations with a bit of insight as to what they could do for their sport as well.
Yeah, and again, I think if we look back to Tras's question here about sort of other countries maybe, or other sports that we can look to, I think Ross has kind of highlighted some excellent examples there of some of the other Irish sporting organisations. This is a question we get asked quite regularly by clients, like, what does best in class look like? How do we, what do we need to do some of these things? And this is actually where social listening can really play a role. And you don't have to engage an organization like Olytico to do this. So, if Tras or any of our colleagues have the capacity, a really good starting point is to look at some of the award-winning content that's happened in other countries. And like a shortcut to this is taking some phrases like that. So if you take, award-winning or best in class or, those kind of terms, and link them with your sport and do a very quick search on Twitter, it's very rare that you won't be served a lot of results that will show you organizations or bodies that have won awards for different types of things. Now, they won't all relate to social media, but some of them will. And certainly, we know that each year the Cannes Lions, for example, are something that marketeers look at very carefully, and those who are in the advertising industry look at very carefully for inspiration. And there are a range of awards that happen in Ireland too, but these type of awards happen globally. So if you look up social media awards, social media sports marketing awards, etc., and do very simple searches on the networks themselves, you'll often find really good content coming back. And LinkedIn is a great resource for this too. You'll find people sharing good case studies there. So I can't give specific examples from other countries, and certainly I think Ross has done a good job of sharing some of the ones in Ireland. But if you are looking to other territories, and if sailing was one of the ones you wanted to look at, combining that in a relatively simple search can often uncover some really good examples and some inspiration for things that can be done in Ireland.
I think one thing to point out as well is that it's often quite simple. You know, great is often based on something that is remarkably simple and doesn't require, you know, a television advertising campaign is always going to require, you know, £1 million, €1 million budgets in order to actually sort of, you know, to cut through. You know, you don't see automotive advertising on the television that has been made, you know, out the back of the parking lot. But in social media, and particularly in sport, it's actually the story which can often come through and shine. So it doesn't require enormous budgets. It's more the imagination and the thought that goes into it as well. Referencing back to the previous question about, you know, sort of the, you know, the likes and the sharing and things like that, I'd be interesting to see the dopamine levels of the sporting bodies that you name checked there, Ross, as having done good things. I can imagine a little sort of, you know, blush of pride going up on the, you know, on the cheeks of some of those who've been responsible for them that are listening in today. One more question from the room as well. Just come in from Anonymous, but have you noticed, this is one that is often asked as well, anybody that's doing stuff on the new channels to emerge, and the new channel at the moment is obviously TikTok. My, you know, 13 and 15-year-olds will be telling me about US politics, they'll be telling me about the Premier League, they'll be telling me about all things in the world that I'm interested in, and their perspective is coming from a TikTok perspective. So it's not just all dance and, you know, silliness. Any brands or sports that are doing particularly well in that arena?
Well, like if we take TikTok specifically, and it's probably worth starting with the moment that everyone knows about, because it's probably one that a lot of people can relate to. So Ocean Spray have had kind of their TikTok moment this year, and certainly when we look back at 2020, they will be the brand that would seem to have won it as a network. And maybe for anyone who's on the call who's not familiar, there's a viral piece of content from the network where someone was seen consuming the product while kind of skateboarding down the road. And what's really interesting, and I think what the example serves to illustrate really well, is that in this case, it wasn't the brand who set this up. So this happened organically, and where Ocean Spray's skills and expertise came in was in capitalizing on the moment. And this, I suppose, comes back in lots of ways for us as an organization to just listening. So this moment blew up. And when that moment blew up, Ocean Spray as an organization had a decision to make. This has happened. How do we ensure that this moment generates maximum amplification? And also, how do we ensure that our brand, which is connected to this because there is a moment where the person consumes the product during the 30 seconds, is something that people remember? Because it would be very easily, it would have been very easy for this not to have been connected to the brand, and instead to have focused on, you know, the piece of music, which obviously also got a significant lift. We saw it kind of rise back into the Billboard top 100. So lots of other, and TikTok obviously got a huge amount of publicity on the back of it too, as well as the individual. But what Ocean Spray did was they came up with a really, really nice kind of custom branded truck and a whole ton of product, and got it to the person who featured in the video very quickly. And then that became part of the story. So suddenly Ocean Spray were seen as kind of being reactive, of listening, of recognizing the opportunity, and they became intrinsically linked to the moment itself. And what you then found were loads of spin-offs or parodies or kind of different versions of this being replicated by, you know, both regular people, but also celebrities in lots of different settings. And in a sporting context, we saw golfers, for example, doing this on, you know, on golf courses in the weeks that followed. So I think if sporting bodies are looking at emerging platforms, and TikTok is probably the best known, it's also to know that you don't necessarily have to have a proactive content strategy. You don't necessarily have to be out there creating new content for the network. It can be enough to just check in and see how are people creating content about your, if you're big enough, your sporting body, but more likely your sport. So for example, if we come back to Tras's example, like does sailing feature on TikTok? And if it does, what does it look like? And how do people share content? And are there times when that content is really good and it can then be further shared by you as a sporting body, or do you play a role in it? But I think it's important to note that it can be enough to be consuming this content as an organization and being aware of it, as much as feeling that you have to be out there creating for the network itself.
Yeah, so the secret sauce can actually come from your audience and from those that are participating, and it will always be that way. The national governing body is rarely the one that creates that kind of heart moment that that will create generations perhaps in the future that will fall in love with a particular sport. Back onto the details, the tactics. Sam Curtis from Canoeing Ireland is asking, what's the trade-off between volume and engagement? Is there a trade-off between the two? Would it be better to lower the volume of posts in an attempt to increase the level of engagement, or does a higher volume necessarily lead to greater visibility and therefore greater engagement?
I think this is, from my point of view, it's very simple. It's always quality over quantity. So it's worth putting the time and effort and thought into what you're posting across the 3 channels, because otherwise I think score updates can become wallpaper-like, but it's making sure that the fans, when they go to see the results at the end of the day or midway through a championship or whatever it might be, they can see what's happening without being bombarded with updates. So very simply, I would say it's quality over quantity from that regard.
And I think it can be a case of trial and error too. So I think, in the case of, if we take the specific example of Sam at Canoeing Ireland, I think what I would suggest is test it. So if, for example, Canoeing Ireland maybe are posting once a day on Instagram at the moment and engagement levels are at a certain point, well, what happens if you increase that to twice a day or 3 times a day? Do you start to see a decrease? And, there's no perfect ratio. But certainly I think of all the networks, if you take Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram has the greatest scope at the moment for increased levels of content, because I do think there is still an appetite among sports fans in Ireland that is not being met. It's certainly not at the point where they're like, we've had enough. And I think you see that by the dramatic increases in the volume of engagement that we're seeing on the platform. So I think it is probably platform specific, but if you're thinking about experimenting with this, Sam, I think I would always be inclined to dial up the level of content in the short term and see. And I think particularly on Instagram, you won't see a decrease in engagement. In fact, you might see the inverse. You might see an increase.
I think
it's important to remember as well the fact that that this is social media. So break it down into those two. It's social in that you're engaging with your niche audience, but it is media as well. And it's a number of years past now that the threshold was crossed between picking up a copy of of a daily newspaper, and you will see that, particularly in a UK context around the Premier League, probably about 50 or 60% of the stories that are generated in a newspaper or even in an online environment are driven by something which has happened on social media, be that a player or a club or a team that's making an announcement. They are their own media. So you are your own media. One thing, you mentioned it briefly, Stephen, when you were talking about your own past as a sports agent. I know we've got Mallory Ronan in the room, and congratulations, Mallory. She just moved over to Navy Blue, and you'll be looking after sponsorship and commercial arrangements for a number of stars, a number of the big rugby players and others. The sense of individual athletes coming out and being their own brand, their own personality on social media, lifting them away from being just a member of a team, is something which has been very noticeable, both in the US, in the UK, and here in Ireland. Is there something in that, in terms of how sporting organisations might both encourage and assist the stars of their sport to actually build their own profile?
This is like extremely complicated and complex, and I have a large degree of sympathy for all the various people at the table in terms of these relationships, because I would imagine if you're a sporting body who manages teams, you want your individual athletes to be focused on their performance on the field, and you're not actually that concerned about their social media performance or their individual commercial contracts. If you're an athlete, well, you have to be thinking about those individual commercial contracts, and that's why you engage someone like Navy Blue to look after your best interests and to negotiate on your behalf and to arrange those type of contracts. And then if you're the agency, well, then you want to ensure that the sponsors that you're connecting to your individual athletes see the maximum return on the investment that they're making. And one of the ways that happens is through the social amplification that athletes can bring for brands. And so you'll see in contracts now that, for example, individual athletes might have a certain number of tweets that come as part of their piece, or a certain number of posts on Instagram, or in the way that traditionally it would have been appearances or other kind of things that would have been negotiated. So I think there's a balancing act to strike. I think sporting organizations are increasingly getting better at educating their athletes about social media, and I think it would be remiss not to talk about the negative side of things, because I think from a mental health point of view, when performance is criticized, amongst other things, there's obviously a whole area that needs to be kind of looked at there, and you need to protect your athletes in that way. There also needs to be a level of education about how the athletes themselves use social networks, and I would expand that out to just digital communications in general. As soon as you type something, whether it's in a WhatsApp message or a text message or a piece of public social content, there's a digital record of that. And I think athletes are getting better at that, but we still see cases where something an athlete has shared, either publicly or privately, subsequently becoming available. So there's an education piece there. But I also think you need to see the opportunity that athletes bring, and it can be for everybody, right? So if an athlete uses their social profile really well, and let's come back to Marcus Rashford because he's topical. Right now, he is doing, as a player, he's performing on the pitch. But off the pitch, he is positively amplifying the club that he plays for. He is positively amplifying the country he plays for. He is positively amplifying every single brand that is commercially associated with him and for whom he is an ambassador. And he is making the UK a better place for children who otherwise would be hungry at certain times of the year. So he is this example of where he has strayed or moved purposely into the area of politics and used a position as a power for good. Now, that's not easy to do, and it is also fraught with complications. And I would be very surprised if a team or an agency recommended that their athletes take a public position on politically divisive topics. But at a more basic level, certainly athletes can be encouraged to use their social media profiles for good, and in ways that are not contentious, and in ways that build their following and can have this positive impact. And that has a knock-on effect. And I think the other thing that I would be saying to anybody who's kind of in this position and there may be a sporting body and they've got athletes, I would be looking at the commercial sponsors and saying to them, okay, look, this athlete is going to share a certain number of pieces of content for you because there's a relationship there. But equally, make the most of the association you have with this athlete by talking about them more. Talk about their performances, talk about their successes, profile them, because that will help to build a connection between your brand and them as an individual athlete. So it's not easy to get right, but certainly there are, again, few athletes in Ireland who are probably maximizing the commercial potential that they have from a social media point of view.
Okay.
I would also say some of the key elements to that are involving the athlete that you're working with in some of the content production and the planning for it, because you're always going to get the best out of a player or an athlete or whatever if they're actually engaged with the idea. A lot of I think brands and organizations are definitely getting better at it. But I think over the last few months, we've seen more into the lives of players, coaches and teams and organizations than we have previously. And it's that access and authenticity which has really resonated with the fans and the Irish public as well. So if you want to make the most of these digital assets and make the most of them moving forward in terms of creation, involve the talent more, and you'll actually get the biggest return on your investment if they're involved all the way through, rather than just being brought in at the end to lend their face to it. Actively involve them and engage with them.
Great. Time is against us, and I've got a list of about 100 questions more that I would love to ask, but we did promise that we would get you out on the hour, because that's the way that our new digital world operates now. So for the moment, to Ross Broomfield and Stephen O'Leary from Olytico, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for the continuing partnership we have in terms of bringing these details and this information to light each month. We will be already deep in the analysis of November, and Cork GAA may well feature as part of that. Who knows what this weekend will bring? Perhaps Shane Lowry will pull another miracle out of the bag, or maybe Rory McIlroy. But for the moment, anyway, I'm going to go off now and begin to try and chop this up into little social media shareable nuggets, which we will put out there. So practice what we preach. My thanks to everybody who has taken the time out to join us this morning and for taking an interest in what we do on Sport for Business, but especially for the moment to Ross and Stephen. Thank you very much.